Okay, welcome to the show. It's the Godword Podcast. I'm your host, Casey, and we're returning to Plutarch today. Return to Plutarch. All right, this episode was inspired by a talk I recently watched by Elizabeth Brunig, where she was speaking to the Yale Divinity School graduates. I think it was called the Sorensen Lecture, if you want to look it up. I'm not altogether sure what, Brunig's whole thing is, her politics or whatever, but I gotta admit, that talk made me very sympathetic to her. I liked what she was saying. In general, she defends the idea of ambiguity and mystery against the hubristic aspirations of science, with its demand to know everything. She does some interesting commentary on one of Damien Hirst's installations, and then relatively quickly, in passing, mentions Plutarch's description of a statue of Isis. And to be honest, I had heard this reference before somewhere years ago, maybe in Thoreau or something, but this time I decided to look up the original source, and I found it pretty quickly. It is part of Plutarch's Moralia in the section on Isis and Osiris. So if you wanted to read this, it's not very long at all, probably like 10 pages in a book or so. And if you just Google Plutarch, Isis, Osiris, you'll find it. So this essay takes the form of a letter addressed to a priestess of Apollo who seems to have been initiated into the Egyptian and Delphic rites. Her name was Clea, and Plutarch addresses her as my dear, presumably because he was also a priest of Apollo. His task in the letter seems to be to give her a thorough account of the history of Isis and Osiris. Osiris, by the way, is the Egyptian version of Apollo, so this subject is important to both of them. And to many Romans, even as late as Plutarch's prime of life around 100 AD, it's still important, although it's unclear what percentage of Romans were still actively practicing the ancient forms of the religion and initiation rites at this point in history. My own interest in all of this, you can certainly guess. I mean, the question to me is always to try to figure out what life would have been like for a real Roman citizen who was born around, let's say, 20 AD, and who died around 100 AD. During that period, he would have heard about and kind of felt the riot in Alexandria of 38 AD. He would have been 18 years old. And the beginnings of Christianity. 2 expulsions of the Jews, Caligula, Nero, the destruction of Jerusalem, and if he lived to be 105 years old, he might have even seen the construction of the Pantheon. If he had some cash and status, he would have had access to many of our favorite books. He would have known Hesiod and Homer, Herodotus and Thucydides, Plato and Aristotle, Polybius and Sallust, and so on. It's possible he would have seen reproductions of the plays by Euripides, for example, even, that featured Apollo, and he might have consulted the Pythia himself, even, from time to time. But, here the details get sort of scarce. I mean, what exactly did the oracle do? How did it work? What happened in the Temple of Apollo? And was it all, at least by the year 100 AD, was it all kind of outward ritual observance, or did people really believe the supernatural things said to be occurring in this way? So listen to Plutarch's opening paragraph in this letter. Again, he's addressing it to Clea. He says, "All good things, my dear Clea, sensible men must ask from the gods, and especially do we pray that from those mighty gods we may, in our quest, gain a knowledge of themselves, so far as such a thing is attainable by men. For we believe that there is nothing more important for men to receive, or more ennobling for God of his grace to grant, than the truth. God gives to men the other things for which they express a desire, but of sense and intelligence he grants them only a share, inasmuch as these are his especial possessions and his sphere of activity. For the deity is not blessed by reason of his possession of gold and silver, nor strong because of thunder and lightning, but through knowledge and intelligence." It sounds pretty sincere and earnest to me, although I guess there is some question of what exactly is happening here. Plutarch mentions prayer at the outset, and certainly an attraction to truth seems to be a divine impulse. but he also delivers the first statement of his overarching theme here when he says that men are not given the right or ability to know the deity in full. Instead, we're stuck with a partial revelation. In the next paragraph, Plutarch speaks of Isis, whose name, he reminds Clea, is Greek, or I think it means like sounds Greek. I don't know, this isn't clear. But I read the footnotes on this, and also Isis's enemy, Typhon, whose name, he says, is also Greek. The attempt here with the names is somewhat dubious, but he's trying to connect Isis to the Greek word for to know, and the word Typhon with the phrase in Greek, puff up, okay, which is, I guess, what it sounds like in Greek. So that is basically the goodness that we rightly pay homage to, he's reminding Clea, is about knowledge. And her enemy is pride or satisfied certainty or whatever, being puffed up. Anyway, Plutarch summarizes their mythic standoff, saying, listen carefully, this is fascinating. Quote, Typhon tears to pieces and scatters to the winds the sacred writings, which the goddess, Isis, collects and puts together, and gives into the keeping of those that are initiated into the holy rites. Since this consecration by a strict regimen and by abstinence from many kinds of food and from the lusts of the flesh curtails licentiousness and the love of pleasure, and induces a habit of patient submission to the stern and rigorous services in shrines, the end and aim of which is the knowledge of him who is the first, the Lord of all, the ideal one. Pretty interesting, because I'm fasting today, again, because my skin sucks, which means I'm also, not only am I always not eating grains, alcohol, caffeine, sugar, legumes, nightshades, and so on, but today and yesterday, I'm not even eating at all. So it's like, I gotta say, I get it, the priests, I get it. I feel like I could really light some incense in a temple today, Anyway, first thought here about that quote. First of all, what exactly is Plutarch referring to by sacred writings? Presumably they are lost to us now, although they seem to have been extant in Plutarch's day. The original cult was Egyptian, so perhaps there were some late threads of a surviving Egyptian religion that involved keeping sacred scriptures. But more importantly, what's all this about curtailing licentiousness and the love of pleasure? I thought the Greeks had no notion of morality or the deity before the Jews introduced them to that stuff, right? That's what Strauss tells us. The Greeks are supposed to be scientific and rational. So what's all this about, quote, him who is the first, the Lord of all, the ideal one, with a capital O? I do love that for a name of God, by the way, the ideal one. That's nice, isn't it? But yeah, I guess some of you might criticize all this by saying, look, for the Greeks, God is sort of merely the universe itself. But honestly, I don't get that impression here. I don't think that's really right. This one that Plutarch refers to is said to be ideal, not actual, which suggests like a transcendent realm. Anyway, whatever. All of this is veiled in a bit of mystery, which is fine with me and thematic to this episode, but I get the sense, same that I have of Hinduism, that the learned Greeks, at least, the true initiates like Plutarch himself, understood that sort of beyond or behind all of the avatars, there was the one God, the true one himself. There's an interesting long digression later in the essay, by the way, about the Egyptian origins of religion. Plutarch says that, quote, most people believe that Amun is the name given to Zeus in the land of the Egyptians. And this name, which of course is probably the source for the Hebrew word Amen, I think. Because, we've got like Hagar, Abraham's wife, was Egyptian, and Moses grew up in Egypt. So this seems probable to me, to be honest. But of course, you'll find all sorts of fact-checker websites disputing this claim, saying, no, it's actually a Hebrew word, But, Christians, let's not forget Acts 7:22. Moses was learned in all the lore of Egypt. And it was Moses' writing that first recorded what the Hebrews believed, And Moses was raised Egyptian, for goodness sakes. But okay, I'll let you guys look into this one for yourself. Anyway, Plutarch writes to Clea also about the nature and role of the priests of Isis. I'm going to read you his short third paragraph here, which is about the priests, because it's genuinely fascinating, and then I'll try to add a word or two of clarification. Plutarch says, quote, "These are they who within their own soul, as though within a casket, bear the sacred writings about the gods, clear of all superstition and pedantry. And they cloak them with secrecy, thus giving intimation, some dark and shadowy, some clear and bright, of their concepts about the gods. Intimations of the same sort as are clearly evidenced in the wearing of the sacred garb. For this reason, too, the fact that the deceased votaries of Isis are decked with these garments is a sign that these sacred writings accompany them, and that they pass to the other world possessed of these and of naught else. It is a fact, Clea, that having a beard and wearing a coarse cloak does not make philosophers, nor does dressing in linen and shaving the hair make votaries of Isis. But the true votary of Isis is he who, when he has legitimately received what is set forth in the ceremonies connected with these gods, uses reason in investigating and in studying the truth contained therein." Wow, that's awesome, isn't it? This idea, like he's sort of saying it's not the outward, it's the inward that actually matters. Well, I mean, this religion is not a superstition, is part of what he's telling us here, right? It is derived from reason. You can really feel Plutarch here, sort of trying his best to approximate Logos itself. I guess no one told him about Christ as Logos yet. Our God, he's saying, is not an arbitrary mythological children's tale, but she can be discovered using reason in investigating. But then doesn't he kind of draw us back into a corner here and prove that the Greeks were, after all, just scientific rationalists with no higher truth, theologically? Well, as St. Paul says, by no means. For although the priests of Isis bear their sacred scriptures without superstition or pedantry, they nevertheless understand that nothing outward or merely physical can truly represent divinity. And Plutarch summarizes this idea beautifully with the line, "Having a beard and wearing a coarse cloak does not make philosophers." In other words, there is something behind and beyond appearances, and this is to be the concern of the real priests of Isis. So you might say, okay, so they were like Protestants with no meaningful liturgy? No wonder they're all gone, right? Well, no. In fact, Plutarch takes time to describe their outward form in great detail. But he wants to make sure that the point isn't lost. The outward is merely a tool of anamnesis, a reminder of the truth itself, which is to be found inwardly. You've probably seen movies featuring at least loose approximations of these Egyptian priests. They're always like thin and bald, right? Well, Plutarch explains why. Listen to this. He says, "It is true that most peoples are unaware of this very ordinary and minor matter. The reason why the priests remove their hair and wear linen garments. Some persons do not care at all to have any knowledge about such things, while others say that the priests, because they revere the sheep, abstain from using its wool as well as its flesh, and they shave their heads as a sign of mourning, and that they wear their linen garments because of the color which the flax displays when in bloom, and which is likely to the heavenly azure which enfolds the universe. But for all this, there is only one true reason, which is to be found in the words of Plato. Quote, 'For the impure to touch the pure is contrary to divine ordinance. No surplus left over from food and no excrementitious matter is pure and clean, and it is from forms of surplus that wool, fur, hair, and nails originate and grow. So it would be ridiculous that these persons, in their holy living, should remove their own hair by shaving and making their bodies smooth all over, and then should put on and wear the hair of domestic animals. So this is why they wear flax instead of like animal skins. Okay, well, you get it. The idea here, if you missed it, is a kind of asceticism among the priest class. The goal of the priest seems to have been to fall into a perfect harmony with nature, such that there was no extraneous or superfluous intake. The priest is healthy, but not overfed in the slightest. And in fact, they take this quite far. Again, far enough that some of this sounds oddly familiar to Mosaic law type stuff, by the way. For example, Plutarch says, quote, "The priests feel such repugnance for things that are of a superfluous nature that they not only eschew most legumes, as well as mutton and pork, which leave a large residuum, but they also use no salt with their food during their periods of holy living. For this they have various other reasons, but in particular the fact that salt, by sharpening the appetite, makes them more inclined to drinking and eating." What's interesting in this is that these restrictions are not arbitrary or whimsical on the part of the god. Think back to the Euthyphro dialogue of Plato, where the question was whether what is holy because God says so, or whether God says so only to indicate that it's holy. It actually is holy. The explanation for avoiding pork here is practical, not mystical. It is intelligible and can be understood by the reason, Plutarch says. Now, none of this is to try to suggest something scandalous, like that Judaism was merely a plagiarism of Egyptian religion or a spin-off, but it is interesting to think about Moses growing up in the Egyptian court. I think he was 40, it says, before he finally turncoated and, became who he was. And so in those 40 years, it's hard to believe that there was nothing redeeming or good in Egypt at all. Instead, we might work backwards here and deduce that when Moses left Egypt, he tried to take with him the best of what he learned there. He was salvaging what was holy, what was still true, taking out into the desert with him and his people the best from Egypt. I'm speculating, playing at midrash here, of course, but we might make a lesson of this, I think. America, to a lot of us, does seem to be collapsing or flagging, and Western civilization is turning brutal and degenerate pretty fast. But before we leave, the lesson ought to be, let's try to extract what was good and take that with us and not forget. So things like Plutarch's writing, I would imagine, Anyway, there's a bit more about the religious restrictions. The Egyptian priests generally did not bring wine into the temple, and all Egyptians avoided eating the pike fish, which they referred to as the oxyrhynchus. The priests, in fact, abstained from fish altogether, thinking it to be an unnecessary and superfluous food, Plutarch says. Well, that sounds odd to me. I mean, we have these modern ideas given to us by science that fish has a bunch of omega-3s and is a good source of lean protein and so on. But Plutarch insists that nothing that is irrational or fabulous or prompted by superstition, as some believe, has ever been given a place in their rites. Okay, and yet he also adds that, quote, "in their rites there are some things that have moral and practical values." The writing here is truly tantalizing. It's sort of unfortunate for curious people like me that Plutarch's writing to a fellow initiate here. Because for us, that means that he's sort of relying on her, a priori understanding. So the basic facts go unstated. We have to try to deduce or imagine how all of this looked in practice. Although we also have interesting intermediary texts, like Euripides' Ion play, for example, which is centered around a temple of Apollo. Anyway, in all of this, you get the sense that Plutarch knows that the hour is late on these ancient religious forms. He seems to see himself as a kind of archivist of religion. I guess the way I would put it here is that he clearly believes that the earlier practitioners were sort of doing it better, or were more authentic. This is the way that I kind of think the early church did it better than your average down-the-road Methodist or something. But he's encouraging Clea to try to keep the flame alive. That's the whole point of the dialogue. And so listen to how he describes the earlier priests. He says, quote, "Moreover, they relate that the ancient Egyptians put from them luxury and self-indulgence to such a degree that they used to say that there was a pillar standing in the temple of Thebes, which had been inscribed upon it in curses against Manes, their king, who was the first to lead the Egyptians to quit their frugal, thrifty, and simple manner of living. It is said also that Technactus, the father of Boccharis, when he was leading his army against the Arabians because his baggage was slow in arriving, found pleasure in eating such common food as was available, and afterwards slept soundly on a bedding of straw, and thus became fond of frugal living. As the result, he invoked a curse upon Minos, and, with the approval of the priests, had a pillar set up with the curse inscribed upon it. So it sounds like we had these Spartan-like, almost ascetic, ancient Egyptians who were then undermined or subverted by some of their own later kings who began to indulge themselves. These kings he refers to, by the way, are dated to around 725 BC. Plutarch is writing 800 years later, and we have the sense that Egypt is all but collapsed spiritually now, and what embers still burn in Plutarch's day are carried on in the Greco-Roman initiation religious cults. There's a famous line in this text by Plutarch on Osiris and Isis, the one that Liz Brunig cited in her talk, where Plutarch refers to an ancient statue of Isis. He says, quote, I think he's talking of the priests here, "Their philosophy, for the most part, is veiled in myths, and their words containing dim reflections and adumbrations of the truth, as they themselves intimate beyond question by appropriately placing sphinxes before their shrines to indicate that their religious teaching has in it an enigmatical sort of wisdom. In Sais, the statue of Athena, whom they believed to be Isis, bore the inscription,
'I am all that has been, and is, and shall be, and my robe no mortal has yet uncovered.'"
Well, this is the stuff of legend, and it inspired artists and thinkers all the way through the 19th century. The statue was long gone, even by Plutarch's time, but as it was referred to by people like Henry David Thoreau or Hawthorne in the 19th century, or various artists, there's paintings of this and etchings, it came to represent the divine principle itself, which was understood by acolytes to be in a perennial contest with the cold hard gaze of science, which strove to remove all veils. And here, of course, there's also the parallel to the God of the Old Testament, whose face was never seen. Well, I mean, there's that annoying part in Exodus 33, where in verse 20, it quotes God saying, "No man can see me and live." But that happens just after, up in verse 11 of chapter 30, same chapter. God said, the narrator said, "The Lord used to speak to Moses face to face." So it's not exactly clear what's going on there. But in general, certainly there is something veiled and hidden in our inherited sense of the divinity. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." So yeah, Isis was a mystery cult. The truth was behind the veil, and the veil never came off. And it was this mysteriousness that inspired Greek civilization, Plutarch hints. He says, quote, "Witness to this also are the wisest of the Greeks, Solon, Thales, Plato, Eudoxus, Pythagoras, who came to Egypt and consorted with the priests. And in this number some would include Lycurgus also. Eudoxus, they say, received instruction from Connuphis of Memphis, Solon from Sonchus of Sais, and Pythagoras from Onuphis of Heliopolis. Pythagoras, it seems, was greatly admired, and he also greatly admired the Egyptian priests, and, copying their symbolism and occult teachings, incorporated his doctrines in enigmas." What an all-star team we have there, huh? I mean, all of them went to Egypt to receive instruction, and the instruction that they received left intact a certain amount of mystery. So this is no childish fantasy tale, but this is the deep well itself. So Plutarch reminds Clea that the interpretation must never be explicit and literal and basic. Instead, he says, quote, "Therefore, Clea, whenever you hear the traditional tales which the Egyptians tell about the gods, their wanderings, dismemberments, and many experiences of this sort, you must remember what has already been said, and you must not think that any of these tales actually happened in the manner in which they are related. The facts are that they do not call the dog by the name Hermes as his proper name, but they bring into association with the most astute of their gods that animal's watchfulness and wakefulness and wisdom, since he distinguishes between what is friendly and what is hostile by his knowledge of the one and his ignorance of the other, as Plato remarks. Nor again do they believe that the sun rises as a newborn babe from the lotus, but they portray the rising of the sun in this manner to indicate allegorically the enkindling of the sun from the waters." End quote. I mean, by the way, this reminds me some of, like, I got to do an episode on Virgil's fourth eclogue. That whole thing that's like, I think Virgil wrote, I guess, before Plutarch by about 100 years, but it's like, you know, there were these, like, kind of groping to try to understand God in the first century in Rome by some of their best, you know? And maybe, like, in Virgil's case, he never heard of Jesus or the Christ or even Logos, but, like, there's a sense in his poetry that, like, it's coming, we're near it, you know, something is happening here. And I think the same is kind of true for Plutarch, although he tended to look backwards to try to extract from the past or preserve from the past what still was true of the old religion. Anyway, the point is, there may have been a real talking snake in a real luxurious garden at the beginning of time, but the snake also might indicate something deeper, something that's harder to articulate, whose origin is difficult to pinpoint, whose influence is largely subterranean. And this is why we see it in the Epic of Gilgamesh in a completely different context, but it, again, steals the herb of life and makes it so that Gilgamesh, you know, doesn't get to live forever, exactly like with Adam and Eve, right? The real priests, Plutarch suggests, are the ones who are able to trace these subtextual meanings. So the rest of this letter goes on to tell the whole story of Osiris. You may have heard of it, his dismemberment and the scattering of his body into 14 pieces by Typhon, and some stuff about his penis getting thrown in the Nile and eaten by the fish, which is why they don't eat the pikes, by the way, and whatever. And also some stuff about Isis's son Horus. And as you read this whole thing slowly and carefully, at times you feel almost like a eureka coming on, like this must almost be the clue that unlocks everything, but instead the mystery endures, and nothing final is disclosed in this letter. The veil remains unlifted, and I gotta say, thank God. Hey, thanks for listening to the Godward podcast. If you like this show, consider the link in the description. I mean, shit. For $5 a month, I sing and dance with the classics like a trained monkey. And then, twice a month, I host 3-hour secret streams. And, I mean, these are probably the best conversation on the internet, to be honest. It's as good as that testicular cancer group in Fight Club. And I'm not even kidding. Come join us. We have one tonight, actually, Friday at 9 p.m. And we'll do one again on like December 2nd or whatever it would be. It's absolutely a bargain. Even if you don't want to sign up, like and share the video. Tell your moms thanks for listening. Go outside and have a walk. Get me to 1,000 subs, by the way. I've been lingering at like 994. That is your only job. Help spread the good word. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening.